In response to COVID-19, PSP is offering telefitness to Canadian Armed Forces members. By using social media platforms, the telefitness classes tailored to Canadian Armed Forces personnel became accessible to all. Prior to participating in this session and to make an informed decision on whether you should seek advice from a qualified exercise professional or healthcare provider, consult the Get Active questionnaire of the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology and its reference document.
In today's video, I'll expand on Petawawa's last couple core classes that have been moving you through the core training continuum. In case you missed those, I'll go over a couple recaps. We went through the basic anatomy of the spine, discussing the role of the musculature and joints around it, establishing that the lower portion of the torso, or everything surrounding the lumbar region of the spine, or that low back area, is made for stiffness. This means the muscles of the abdominals, the obliques, the low back, and all the deeper internal muscles, their role is to stabilize the spine and protect that lumbar spine against injury. Everything above and below is made for movement. So that means that this upper portion of the spine, or the T-spine region, is where we create movement and want mobility. We want the muscles around that area functioning properly and the joints to be mobile. And then below that as well, in the hip complex, mobile joints and proper functioning muscles is what we're looking for. Before we move to any more complex types of training, we need to master the bracing sequence, which will strengthen the neuromuscular connection, or the brain to body connection. That means that you're training the firing pattern so that your brain is telling the right muscles in your core to fire at the right time for the right amount of time to create this stability in that lumbar region of the spine to protect the low back. Past that, learning how to breathe properly and the relationship that your breath plays in stabilizing the spine is equally as important. Taking full diaphragmatic or belly breaths is how we create intra-abdominal pressure that will further enhance the stability in that lower portion of our torso. And both of those things, bracing and breathing, are things that we've touched on already. So if you're not familiar with them and you haven't mastered them, I recommend backtracking a little bit and doing some research on your own to make sure you understand their role and then how to apply them so that you can further your practice for core training. We also challenge the endurance a little bit more through the stabilizers. On the floor, working dead bug, adding the resistance of your body weight into a plank, side plank, and bridge. And then in a standing position, getting a little bit more challenging, we added load in anti-lateral and anti-rotation using bands and kettlebells. And again, those are more complex styles of training that you kind of need a prerequisite for. And then today we're going to go even further into a rotation and a transfer of power. I'll just quickly discuss some of the important prereqs and factors that come into play when we are transferring power. And we're going to keep it really simple today. Instead of adding load, we're going to use body weight and train basic boxing technique to get that rotation and the understanding of how you create power from the floor and transfer it through a stiffened core and then out your limbs.
Understanding the role and function of joints in movement is a good way for you to choose the type of training that'll be most effective and safe for you. All joints need some degree of mobility and stability, but the key is understanding the role that they're more specifically designed to play, and then how their role relates to the other joints around it. Generally speaking, the architecture of the joint is designed for a function of either stability or mobility. And the two functions will alternate joint by joint from the bottom of the body to the top. So if you look at the diagram, the ankle is for mobility. Above that, our knee is stable. Hips are designed for mobility. Our lumbar region of the spine, or that low back area, is for stability. Above that, in the mid-back or thoracic spine, is made for mobility. And then above that, under the neck, in the scapular region or around the shoulder blades, that'll be made for stability. The shoulders are quite mobile, so again, that's an area for mobility. And then past that, your elbows will be more of a stable joint. Stable joints are optimized when they're maintaining their position or undergoing a controlled movement, where mobile joints are more for performing large, forceful movements with higher ranges of motion. Although the joints can be broken up and designated these more specific roles, how they all function together is much more important. Deficiencies at any level can cause compensation that leads to dysfunctional movement patterns, and that can enhance the risk of injury. So like I mentioned before, if the hips or the thoracic spine lack mobility, it's the lumbar spine that'll try to perform this function. And it's another reason why training and moving in functional patterns instead of isolating muscles has a greater carryover to performance and injury prevention. Each joint supports movement in the kinetic chain. The kinetic chain is the notion that joints and segments have an effect on one another during movement. When one is in motion, it creates a chain of events that affects the neighboring joints and segments. Core stability is integral for proper function, force production, and power output through the kinetic chain. As leading spine researcher Dr. McGill states, proximal stiffness enhances distal mobility and athleticism, meaning a strong, stable core is essential to transfer power through the body out to the limbs. In functional full-body movements like punching or throwing, kinetic energy is developed from the floor, power is generated by the hips, and then transferred through the torso, and the energy is dispelled through the upper body. Basically, the ability to create and maintain adequate tension in the core musculature means power is utilized more effectively in the transfer force musculature, which is considered to be everything around the hips, the legs, and the shoulder complex. Before you add the complexity of speed and load, you must firmly establish proficiency in basic movement patterns and develop coordination. Using a systematic approach to progress through your core training and move to rotational or speed and power exercises is key. The ability to decelerate speed and control rotational force is just as important as creating it. So the true goal in rotation is actually to resist excessive motion. This means anti-lateral and anti-rotation exercise actually enhance the ability to create and control rotational power. This is a perfect example of practice makes permanent. Training and eventually mastering the neuromuscular firing pattern that generates the flow of energy through the kinetic chain and will pave the way for efficiency and ease in functional movements. As you can see, many factors come into play to develop and support functional movement. None of these components work independently. Understanding and mastering all aspects will assist you in progression and improve performance. Having strong stabilizers, mobility, load transfer forces, good posture and balance, the ability to recruit the proper muscles and enhance the neuromuscular connection, creating strength and endurance, and then translating that to more of a dynamic stability are all the foundation of good movement. Here's an example of what I would consider a systematic approach to rotational training. Always including some form of anti-lateral and anti-rotation exercise in your training will ensure that you're creating the strength that's necessary for rotational movement and the deceleration to protect the spine during that movement. Then utilizing resistance bands or cables to do chops from the floor, either in a half kneeling or kneeling position, and then eventually from standing. Changing to a loaded chop utilizing a sandbag or a plate or a kettlebell. With the lever lengthened and the load further from the body, it'll challenge you a little bit more to create that stability and movement through the hip. You can do that from the floor or graduate to standing as well. Next, you could include an axe or sledge swing where we're adding velocity but still have a lighter load that we're moving. From there, utilizing medicine ball throws with a little bit heavier of a weight, again adding some power and load to progress. And finally, a landmine in a 180 where we're developing the power from the hips but moving a heavier load with more velocity. If you decide to include rotational training in your workouts, ensure that you understand some of the risks that are involved. If you don't take a systematic approach, adding speed or load too early can cause compensation, usually through a lack of movement in the feet and power through the hips. That's what causes greater spinal rotation and puts you at risk of injury. Boxing is a great way to utilize body weight to train rotation and learn to integrate power, which is generated from the floor. The full body movement and skill set required in boxing are a safe and effective way to add complexity to your workouts with little risk of injury. Boxing requires speed, agility, coordination, and challenging dynamic movements. You don't necessarily have to get in the ring to benefit from boxing, but it's worth learning how to do it properly so you get the most out of your training. Today I'm going to take you through the basic form of boxing. Once it's mastered, it can offer another great way to train without equipment. We're going to start with our stance. We've already established that in functional movements, power is created from the floor, so it only makes sense that we start with a solid foundation.
Many aspects of boxing have carryover in other forms of fitness, your job, and everyday life. One of those is balance. Balance is essential in boxing and must be maintained despite movement and outside forces. In order to find and keep your balance in boxing, you have to have a solid stance and effective footwork. We're going to start by finding our stance. If you're left-handed, you can reverse everything I'm saying. If I say left, you use right, and vice versa. And it's important to note that everyone's anatomy is different, so I'll give you some tips to find your stance, but make sure you're tweaking it to feel balanced based on your body, not based on exactly what my body position is. We'll all begin with our feet shoulder width apart and our hands on our hips. Keeping our arms out of the equation in the beginning helps us focus on the feet. We'll take a step forward with the left foot and drop down so that the right knee is in and around alignment with that front heel. If it's not, you might want to just tweak it down here. We'll stand back up and just note that when you've taken this step forward, you should have an openness created through the hips. So the torso, instead of being square, is now on a slight angle. Naturally, your knee and your foot should follow that. So now there's this slight angle out created with this back leg. We'll let the back heel peel off the floor, so it's just an inch or two above the floor. It doesn't need to be a super jacked calf position that's going to cause cramping. It just needs to hover a couple inches. This is going to allow us to create power from the floor and move more efficiently. With this hands on the hip position, we'll note if the hip and the shoulder are in alignment. What we want is now the core to stay stiff all the time and the hip and the shoulder to be connected by that contraction of the core. So these now move together. So as we've created this angle through the hips, it should also be mirrored by the shoulders. Our chin can tuck down slightly, and you'll want to look through your eyebrows so that you have a perfect alignment of the spine from your crown of the head through the shoulders down to the tailbone. When we're standing upright, our alignment is straight from the hip up. As soon as you change the position of the hips or open them, we create a natural angle through the torso, and that should be maintained. That's going to help us create balance, that we can shift back and forth slightly and side to side without losing our equilibrium. So essentially the torso should kind of stay in a straight line above the split of the feet. And now that we've opened the legs, it's no longer straight down here. It follows that slight angle. So bend your knees slightly and notice that softness that you can create that makes you feel more athletic. At no point do we ever lock out the knees because that's going to steal our balance. Take a quick second to shift your weight forward, back, and left, right. Root down to the floor with those bent knees, and even though this front heel is technically glued to the floor, it shouldn't be a heavy pressure. The pressure should be more through the ball of the foot on that front leg and the back leg. So imagine somebody came to push you. Would you fall backwards? Would you have to lean in to brace against that? Or could you just sit down and work against that pressure? That's essentially what we're looking for with the balance. That would be the outside force that we're talking about. And from there, when we add our footwork, we'll learn to balance despite movement. So this is the basics of the footwork. Again, you can tweak it slightly. With this back foot, you can either move in or slightly back. You might want to stagger your stance a little less or more. Those are all options for you, but there's a few key essentials that we need. That's the angle of the hips, heel off the floor, shoulders stay relaxed back and down, slight chin tuck, and that angle of the body. Now that you've found your stance, your goal is to maintain this position at all times and make it very comfortable as you reset. It means we have to spend quite a bit of time in the beginning to get that brain-to-body connection and make this realistic. It's quite awkward compared to how we're used to moving. Instead of walking and crossing your legs, this is a position that needs to be maintained at all times, so movement turns more crab-like. When we move forward, we only want to deviate for a split second, so that means you have to move with the closest leg to the direction you're going. If I want to move forward, I lead left, tiny step, and then I follow with my right with the exact same distance so that I'm right back to the stance that I want and started with. When I move backwards, my back leg leads and my front leg follows. Again, it's a good idea to just reset, make sure that you haven't closed that distance, and as we progress, it becomes a little bit easier. Getting a bit more complex will be your lateral movement. If we move to the left, you have to lead with the leg closest to that direction. So we would lead left and close the gap as quickly as we can, back to our stance, testing, shifting the weight, making sure that we're right back to where we're supposed to be. And then lastly, moving to the right, we lead with the right leg, follow with the left, and one more time we can just reset. So mastering those 4 movements of forward, back, left, right is essential to be able to move on to anything else. Because if we can't ingrain this pattern in our brain, then we're very vulnerable to losing balance. Every time we lift a foot, we're vulnerable. So the movements need to be quick and efficient. It's not a big movement, and it's not walking. So I mentioned before in our stance, we keep the weight of the front leg on the ball of the foot, and that's going to play in when it comes to your quick movement. If I do a step with the ball of the foot and follow with my back one, it's a lot more efficient and quicker than if I were to heavy heel step to get there. So we become a lot more cat-like in the movements instead of kind of that clunky heel-to-toe walking that people usually do. One cue that can be helpful, if you're wearing socks at least, is almost a slide of the foot. So it doesn't turn into like a heavy club foot drag, but just the idea where you don't have to step high to move makes it a bit more efficient. So you would step and almost slide that foot. Step, slide. It's again not a heavy drag, but it can help just having that slight contact with the floor to take you there. So having a sock or a proper boxing boot would be helpful for that, or just the right surface. So again, this is called the Cuban foot drill, and it's really just the basic 4-point foot drill that will take you to anything more progressive in boxing. Step forward, reset, back, reset, left, reset, and right, reset. So it's almost like your feet are split like this permanently, but also tethered together. So when one moves, the other moves the exact same amount. Retesting in the beginning is really important, and going slowly as well is very important. The faster we go, the more sloppy we get. It shouldn't be just a little tip-tap dance. Every step you take, you need to reset, root to the floor, and again, in the beginning, testing your balance. Are you where you need to be? If somebody pushed you, would they push you over? And from here, just those 4 steps are the building blocks that'll take you to everything more progressive in this sport. Another footwork drill you'll want to master is the pivot. Helps you get out of the way of an opponent quickly, change your angles, and cut off the ring. I would recommend doing this on carpet or putting a pair of socks on just to add a little bit of ease with your movement. Again, in boxing, you'd be wearing proper boxing shoes on proper surface, so it makes that type of movement quite realistic and efficient. In your stance again, we can pivot to both the left and the right, but once you get a little bit further into progression with your arms, we'll kind of note when to use what if you're in close or far away. For now, we'll just keep it simple. A 4-point pivot should take you directly back to where you started. So it means when we pivot, we only do quarter turns. All of the movement comes off the ball of the front leg, which stays stationary, and then the right leg is going to be what moves. So if we're going to move to the left, we'll we'll start with this pivot off the front leg, pivoting quarter turn, quarter turn, quarter turn, and quarter turn. I should be right back to where I started. A good idea is to use that reset in between each pivot to make sure that you're right where you need to be, because people tend to have the tendency to over pivot and close that gap. If I'm going to go to the other direction, same thing applies. We pivot 1, pivot 2, 3, and 4 should take me right back to where I started. If I'm over pivoting, then I kind of close myself off. I'm crossed over with my legs, I'm off balance, so it's really important to understand where your feet need to be in the pivot and how to utilize it properly. It's just small quarter turns. The body's not very big, it can just blast past you pretty quickly on that slight turn. And again, we want to add that with our footwork to start to create a little bit more complexity to what we're able to do in the ring. So something that you can add on top of that would be 1 step, resetting, and then pivoting. Step, reset, pivot. Step, reset, pivot. So there are simple, small movements where we're adding that reset in between and trying not to get too quick or complex too soon. Mastering both that 4-point foot drill, maybe layering in the pivots on top of there, and just getting used to changing an angle, but then getting right back to your stance as quickly as possible. Once you've mastered your 4-point foot drill and understand how to utilize pivots, we can progress to putting steps together and adding movement. We'll start with forward back, but it's important to understand that it's a dangerous place to be just moving forward and back in the ring without your hands moving too. So understand that it's not something that you would utilize for movement very often. It's something you want to learn how to do so that you can punch with it eventually. Because if we move forward with no hands involved, we're essentially giving some momentum to our opponent in case they want to be offensive on us. So our best bet is to move forward while we punch. Same with backwards. If we're moving backwards and our opponent's moving in on us, they're going to be able to gain some momentum while we're losing it. So we need to be able to understand how to punch while we move back. But that's going to be a little bit further down the line, so let's first learn how to master our movement through our feet. We'll keep the hands on the hips for this. It's also important to understand that even though we want to be light on our feet and able to move quickly, we want to avoid this bouncing you'll see a lot of people do. It's a waste of energy and it's a dangerous place to be again, because if you get caught and your both feet are off the floor, you're probably going to end up on your butt. So understanding that we look to find efficiency before we add the speed is how we want to kind of progress with this. So this, even though it might look cooler, it might feel better, like you're burning more energy, it's best to get into the movement and master it and then add speed so that you can look like that but be doing something more than just jumping around. So from our stance, if we're going to move forward, we step and follow the exact same amount. If we move backwards, remember we move with the closest leg to that direction, and same with both your left and your right. So I would start with 3 or 4 steps at a time just to get that feeling of forward, back, left, right, and taking some time to adjust and assess. Are you comfortable in that position, or are you way off balance with that step? One thing that commonly happens is when you're moving to the side, you'll close the gap, and if you ever end up with your feet one behind the other, you're in a dangerous place. So we keep that stance all the time. It's important that we start to really ingrain that stance into the brain, even when we're adding more movements than one. So coming forward, coming back, left, and right. Again, it can be almost like a drag, just not a club foot drag, and we never close that gap. This is where a mirror becomes very handy. One of the things that we're going to get to next, and something that's really helpful for the fact that most of us don't have a gym right now, is that shadow boxing is a really integral part of boxing, and it's watching someone do something properly and then going into a mirror and trying to recreate that. Being able to watch your body and see what it's doing can be very helpful for that. Past that, you'll start to do these things, say if you're watching TV, where you're just trying to ingrain the motor pattern or strengthen that neuromuscular connection. But as soon as we're adding movement, we need that coordination, we need that reflex, we need everything firing properly. So it's kind of layering the complexity, and you have to earn your right for that. So it means that this needs to be mastered before we can get to the fancy stuff, adding all those movements in together, or even adding the hands. One last thing before we get started on our hands is mastering the transfer of weight through the hips, or the rotation from the hips and the shoulders through a stiffened core. The kinetic energy that we create from the floor is what we're going to get for the power output through our hands. Mastering this is essential. As soon as the hands come into play, a lot of people lose the ability to create this power from the floor, or this rotation, and they think that they can create power just from arm punching, but it's very ineffective. We can use less energy and be a lot more effective in this power output if we're rotating properly. So let's master it without the arms kind of in the way. Hands are on the hips and we're back in our stance. We already kind of established why keeping the weight on the balls of the feet is important for movement. We don't want to be walking on our heels because it's very slow and it works as brakes, which makes us not as efficient if we're trying to be more efficient with our footwork. So past that, to create power, we actually need to be able to stay on the balls of the feet and create that balance and maintain it through that output. When we jab using our left hand, the twist is going to be a little bit smaller and it's going to feel like not much comes of it, but it comes down to more of a bracing or a bearing down heavier through the rib cage to create the power here. We take the left hip and we just rotate it so that it points forward at your opponent and your right hip just comes backwards. With our hands glued to our hips, our elbows actually move with the hips, because we've already talked about how important it is to keep the hip and the shoulder moving together with that rigid core. So from this position, our jab is just a very simple left hip forward, right hip back, and shoulders working with it. So you'll notice that my head stays forward the whole time. That's one thing that we should start noting, is that you always want to be looking at your opponent. So even though the shoulders and the hips move, your head stays forward, your chin stays tucked. We talked about looking through the eyebrows. We're going to maintain that. That nice soft knee, snapping, left hip forward, right hip back. Left hip forward, right hip back. And this position is right back to where we wanted to start. Resist the urge to try to load it and throw it to get more power. It should be just more of a contraction through the abdominals and bearing down, and that's where the breath can come into play. So you'll see it utilized in stuff like tennis, where people are trying to get a harder exertion. That's the same thing with boxing. If you want to hit harder, exhale, bear down, increase the intra-abdominal pressure, and that's going to help with the power output. So we go a little bit slower in the beginning. You worry about that power output later. We establish the base that's going to give us the perfect form. Then we speed things up a bit, and then we would add the power. So from here, just that tiny movement. If you were in a mirror, you have that angle that's created already, and all you want to do is move so that the whole side of your butt cheek is kind of visible to the opponent, or the mirror in that case. In case of shadow boxing with a mirror, it would be just moving from the slight angle to that full angle. So you turn very skinny, you're way less of a large target, and it's creating some power through there. So the jab, smaller, it feels almost annoying how small it is, but make sure that you don't overthrow. So it should kind of end right here with your elbow pointed directly in front of you. Don't overthrow or lean into it. Even at the end of the jab, you should be able to kind of feel balanced. Another thing to avoid is hinging at the hips. So we don't like booty pop out to the side to get there. We sit down and just gently twist. We don't really have any movement through this back foot, but you might notice that that knee needs to mobilize a tiny bit to get that position. but it's not that I move my back foot at all. It just kind of stays where it is. And again, weight through this front ball of the foot. So practice it a few times. One more thing I'll note is that when you're trying to move into this twist or get distance created with your arm, you'll never stand up straight or lean forward. We actually stay exactly where we are, and we'll progress further from this position, learning how to get closer using a few different tools, and one of them is not an extended leg or a reach. Everything sits down. Make sure in the beginning to create the proper pattern of firing and finishing of all of these movements that you're doing it slow and controlled, and you're practicing it. Because if we don't practice it, it doesn't groove the pattern, and that's where bad habits happen. And you'll see a lot of bad habits in boxing. It kind of goes with the territory of boxercise and stuff, where you'll see people jumping around and flailing around. And it's really taking away from some of the importance of the rotation and functional movement with it. And it's a bit of a mockery of the sport, I'll have to be honest about. So hands on the hips, slow in the beginning. It's not as like fun or fast or difficult, some people would say, but again, if we just make sure that we're grooving these patterns properly, mastering our footwork, we're going to be way better off to get into the harder stuff in the future, and we'll be more effective when we do. The weight transfer for our cross or right hand is going to come from the floor, and we'll be creating torque off the floor. It's initiated by first pointing your toe to point at your opponent. This is one of the reasons that we keep the heel off the floor all the time, so that we have that ability to create torque quickly and efficiently. It's another reason that we have the angle created as well. If we already have the toe pointed forward, we can't actually generate power through the hip off the floor. So it's just hitting home the importance of that angle and the heel being off the floor. From there, initiating to a bent knee and a rotation through the hips, right hip forward, shoulder moves with it, left hip and shoulder move back, head stays forward directly at your opponent, and then resetting from there. We start at the toe, slight torque, to knee, hip, shoulder. The reset should be back to where we started every time. We don't come to standing completely, we always keep that slight bend in the knee and reset. Taking a second to make sure that you're reset with your balance and stability every single time will hit home the firing pattern through your body. Rotate, reset. Rotate, reset. You'll have to mobilize a little bit through the hip complex to allow that ability to mobilize the hips and create that power. We talked about how this is where power is created, not through here. This stays rigid, connects the shoulder and hip. Perfect example of true functional rotational power and how we get there. Created off the floor and outputted. And again, without the hands involved, it really hits home how much real rotation we need through the hips to be able to get the shoulder and the hip and the elbow pointed at your opponent. It's going to feel a lot different than that jab hand, where it's easier to get the elbow around. As long as we're really clued in, it'll all make a lot more sense when the hand's involved. But we really want to solidify that proper transfer of weight through the hips before we get started. Past that, once we've worked on both the jab and the cross individually and mastered the transfer of weight without any momentum, we can put them together. It's very common to talk about your jab cross combinations or any type of combinations in boxing, and one of the reasons is we can create power from one punch that's actually transferred through to the other punch. Another reason we can't stop in the middle or kink that chain of events, because it'll take power or bleed power out of that. If we're going to put them together, jab, cross in one fluid motion. We can reset, jab, cross, reset, jab, cross, reset, jab, cross, reset. So these are the basics we want to master before we move into our punching with our arms. Understanding how to bear down and keep that tension on the core. Slight exhalations to create a little bit more force. Being relaxed in the right muscles and contracted in the right muscles. So this is where we're rigid. We have to be able to be a little bit more mobile through our lower portion of our body, and then we're going to get a little bit further into how we have to create a little bit of mobility through the upper body as well, and still stability on top of that. And that's what becomes complex about boxing, is we have to be firing at the right times for stability, but also relaxing at the right times and being mobile at the right time. Basic placement for your hands is a little bit different between your left and right. Your left hand or jab hand sits out in front of your eye socket a little bit. Your jab is a punch that you want to be a little bit faster, and we're not going to have as much power on it. So it being closer to your opponent means that you'll be able to feel out and find your range a little bit faster and more effectively. That left hand will be in a nice gentle fist with the pinky pointed towards your opponent. If you were in a mirror, you shouldn't be able to see this left eye because the fist is kind of sitting out in front of it. Right now, we should be able to see it in your peripheral vision. Elbow points down and shoulder stays kind of back and down, fairly relaxed. Your right hand touches against the right orbital, which is the bone right underneath your eye, and having that little connection of skin to skin, or if you were wearing gloves, glove to skin, it's a great thing to get really used to because it means that you're safe. So understanding that this hand touching is a really safe place to be can help to train your hand to come back to where it needs to be. Both elbows point down at the floor, and this is where the chin tuck is really important. With the chin tucked, looking through the eyebrows, we create almost like a little window so that we can see everything that's going on. When you're actually looking at yourself in the mirror or an opponent, you'll be looking at their clavicle or chest region. Avoid looking down at people's feet or directly in their eyes because it's a lot harder to see in your peripherals what's going on. If we're looking at that solar plexus area, and we have this little window created, we'll be able to see movement that might be starting at the feet, which means when it comes to footwork, we can cut the ring off faster and be offensive easier. When it comes to the hands, you'll be able to see what's happening in their torso, maybe rotation starting from the floor or watching their shoulders move, and you might be able to beat them to the punch, so a counter punch, or be defensive or get out of the way quickly to avoid getting any damage done to you. Before we get the jab going, I'd like you to do a quick check-in to make sure your body position is correct. Back heel is off the floor slightly with an outturn of the foot. Weight is through the balls of the feet, soft knees, angle through the hips, elbows pointed down, shoulders relaxed. Fists have a gentle clench with pinkies facing forward, chin is tucked slightly, and you're looking through your eyebrows. Remember that all of the power in the jab comes from the hips. We connect the hip to the shoulder and they move simultaneously through a stiffened core. So before we get started, we have to make sure we understand that rotation or twist that's created from the hips. Once we've allowed the hip and shoulder to move to point to your opponent, that's when we can start releasing the arm. So hip, shoulder are forward, and as soon as they're in that forward position, then we can start extending the arm all the way out and turning the fist at the very end. So from this position, initiate through the hip. Don't lose that ability to rotate from the hip. As soon as we've allowed the shoulder to come forward, arm comes out, elbow goes straight, and at the very end, we just turn over with the fist. Initiate from hip and all the way out. Once we've kind of done it broken up, you can add it together. Your fist works like a cannonball on a chain. You're allowing the power to come from that shoulder, and as soon as we're able to, we shoot forward and turn over at the very end. So the reason that we don't turn the fist over too soon is because when the fist
starts to turn, it'll pop that elbow out and it opens up the whole side of your body. We want to come straight out and straight back. Imagine there's like a PVC pipe directly in front of you and it's only the size of your head. You have to punch in and back through that. Everything initiating from the hips and all the way out. One last thing I'd like to mention on the jab is the importance of a protraction through your shoulder at the very end. So as we come all the way out, we don't just stop. We allow the shoulder to come forward at the very end, and that's going to give us a little extra torque. Added with the turnover, it's a lot more damaging, and it kind of finishes off that whole position. Now from the side, initiate through the hip, the shoulder pushes out, the arm extends, and then the very last thing that happens is that slight protraction. And you can see without the protraction, this is as far as my fist goes. As soon as I add that protraction, that forward movement of the shoulders, then I get a little bit more distance. If you haven't rotated your hips, it's something that'll cut off that distance. I've already talked about how important it is to keep the bend in your knees. You're not getting your length on this punch or your range by reaching forward or leaning. It's by sitting down, twisting, and you can watch my fist move as I twist my hips, and then the last thing is that protraction. So there's a lot of ways you can cut off your range, and one of them would be not fully twisting and not protracting. So that movement back to where it started, out, and straight back to where it came from. On its way down, your fist shouldn't drop. We want to be protecting ourselves at all times, so the way it comes out, it comes right back. And don't come back too hard so that you're twisting backwards. We'll never load this punch. It should start from nothing, and you just want to master that small twist that's going to generate the power. So we do it slow in the beginning to make sure you're really grooving the proper patterns, neuromuscular connection, firing the right things at the right time. And then from there, we can do it a little bit faster. And then from there, as you progress, you can add a little bit more power. Exhaling. And then from there, you can add a gentle step that gives you a bit more range. So that's going to be a little further in the progression. You might want to ease off on that in the beginning and really just master this basic punch. This punch is going to be more for speed and finding your range. It's there to set up your heavy punches, your right hand and your hook. You won't do a lot of damage, but it's really annoying to an opponent if you're putting it in their face constantly. And it can do some damage. It can cause swelling through the orbitals. It's uncomfortable. But again, it's finding range to set up the rest of your punches. So it has a couple different duties. One last thing I'll note about that full protraction is when you're in this position and you're not protracted, your shoulder and chin are quite far away from each other. As soon as you get that shoulder forward, it actually should touch the chin a little bit, just naturally. You shouldn't be working hard to push the chin down. But if you have this right hand where it needs to be and the chin down, at the end of the punch, you're looking directly down your knuckle and you have a very small area where your opponent could do any damage to you. So you end up being fairly safe if we have that protracted position. There's a lot of reasons that we get that full extension. Because it's such a small movement, we want to maximize the range and length we can get on there. When it comes to your cross, this is going to be your power punch. All of the power is created off the floor. This angle of the foot is essential because now we point at the opponent, drop the knee, push the hip forward, like we did when we were just working on our hip transfer. With that elbow down, as the shoulder comes forward, we're going to extend the arm, cannonball on a chain. This back knee bends deeply to allow that rotation to happen. As we get to full extension, we can turn the fist over and protract, making sure that the shoulder comes to the chin. This left hand automatically should come back to the left orbital to keep you safe here, and that'll be the end position. You should feel super solid, so if somebody were to push you on this fist, you wouldn't fall backwards. We want to sit down, and again, never leaning in towards it, just sitting to create that stability and balance from here. From the floor, we initiate turn so that the toe faces the opponent, knee bends, right hip forward, left hip back, extend the arm out after the shoulder, and then right back to where it came from. Initiate off the floor, all the way through. And then if you're comfortable, you can put them together. Jab, cross, jab, cross, jab, cross. Always resetting in between and eventually adding a couple more together. Now that we've gone through all the components individually, I recommend spending some time on each of them separately so that you're making sure you're proficient, especially in the footwork area. When you're comfortable, you can progress to shadow boxing. That's putting all of the movements together and adding a little bit of speed, making sure we're more coordinated and a little bit more agile in all of the movements we make. Keep everything slow and controlled in the beginning to make sure that you're creating the proper movement patterns. If we move through too fast, we can create bad habits quite easily. As you're comfortable, you can begin layering the complexity. Using a mirror or videoing yourself is a good way to self-assess. I'll mention one more time that in shadow boxing, what we try to do is recreate the look of someone who knows what they're doing. So feel free to do more research, find credible coaches, and do some self-assessment to help progress you along. And when you get back to the gym, maybe you'll be comfortable enough to start hitting the bag, or maybe progress further to eventually get in the ring. This last little bit of the video will be me giving a demonstration of shadow boxing, putting together all the things that we worked on today. Thanks for taking the time to watch my video today. Hopefully you've learned some new information and skills that you can apply in your own training and everyday life.